The grand clock of Pembroke Manor struck midnight, its heavy tolls vibrating through the floorboards, but it was the soft, desperate whisper in the library that froze August Sullivan in his tracks. He had expected to find a thief. Instead, he found the newest scullery maid, her hands stained with soot, weeping over his murdered father's locked diary. She was not begging for forgiveness. She was flawlessly translating a royal cipher that had baffled England's greatest minds for a year. In a single breath, the Duke realized the girl cleaning his grates was not merely a servant. She was the key to his family's survival and his greatest danger. To the casual observer, the hierarchy of Pembroke Manor in the autumn of 1815 was as rigid and impenetrable as the stone walls that bordered the vast estate. At the pinnacle sat His Grace, August Sullivan, the Duke of Pembroke, a man whose sudden ascension to the title was shadowed by the mysterious riding accident that had claimed his father. At the absolute bottom, invisible and entirely dispensable, was Bryleigh. Known to the household staff simply as Betty, Bryleigh spent her days in a world of ash, lye soap, and freezing water. Her mornings began long before the sun dared to breach the horizon. By 4 o'clock, she was on her bruised knees, scraping hardened wax from the grand ballroom floor and hauling scuttles of coal up 4 flights of servant stairs. Mrs. Agatha Rutledge, the formidable housekeeper with a spine of steel and an eye for the slightest infraction, ensured that Betty never had a moment's rest. "You missed a spot on the hearth, girl," Mrs. Rutledge barked one frigid Tuesday morning, pointing a bony finger at the intricate marble fireplace in the drawing-room. "Do you think the Duke pays for your keep so you can daydream? Scrub it until I can see my face in the stone." "Yes, Mrs. Rutledge," Bryleigh murmured, keeping her head bowed. The rough-spun fabric of her maid's dress scratched against her skin, a constant, abrasive reminder of how far she had fallen. Just 2 years prior, Bryleigh had not been a maid scrubbing hearths. She had been the Honorable Bryleigh Sterling, daughter of Viscount Sterling, a prominent diplomat who had served closely with Lord Castlereagh. She had danced at Almack's, conversed fluently in French and Italian, and possessed a mind sharpened by her father's tutelage in cryptography and political strategy. But when her father was falsely accused of embezzling crown funds and selling state secrets to the French, her world collapsed. The Viscount, unable to bear the shame, had taken his own life, leaving Bryleigh entirely destitute. Stripped of her title, her assets seized, and her reputation in ruins, she had fled London. She changed her name, buried her aristocratic accent beneath a harsh, breathless mumble, and sought refuge in the deepest anonymity she could find: domestic service. Pembroke Manor was meant to be a hiding place. Instead, it was becoming a prison of agonizing proximity to the life she once knew. August Sullivan, the new Duke, was a brooding presence in the manor. He had returned from the Peninsular War with a hardened jaw, a slight limp in his left leg, and a reputation for profound melancholy. He rarely hosted guests, preferring the isolation of the manor's sprawling library. The servants whispered that he was cursed, or perhaps going mad, obsessed with the circumstances of his father's death. The late Duke's carriage had overturned on a clear, dry night on a straight stretch of road. The local magistrate had ruled it a tragic accident, but the whispers in the servants' hall suggested otherwise. Bryleigh tried to ignore the gossip. Her survival depended on her invisibility, but her natural curiosity, the very trait her father had nurtured, proved impossible to suppress. Her duties occasionally brought her to the Duke's private study to clean the ashes from his grate. It was there, amidst the scent of leather, tobacco, and aged parchment, that Bryleigh felt a desperate pang of homesickness. One afternoon, while sweeping the hearth, her gaze fell upon a leather-bound journal, sitting open on August's massive oak desk. She knew she shouldn't look. To be caught reading the Duke's private papers meant immediate dismissal without a character reference, tantamount to a death sentence for a woman in her position. But the ink on the page caught her eye. It wasn't standard English cursive. It was a chaotic scattering of numbers, Greek letters, and seemingly random punctuation marks. Bryleigh froze, the dustpan trembling in her ash-stained hands. It was a visionaire cipher, heavily modified. Her father had taught her this exact variation. It was a cipher used exclusively by a clandestine faction of the War Office. Why would the late Duke of Pembroke possess a journal written in a military code? Before she could process the implication, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. Bryleigh violently yanked her gaze away from the desk, dropping to her knees just as the heavy mahogany doors swung open. August stepped into the room. He was a striking man, though exhaustion had carved deep shadows beneath his piercing grey eyes. He wore a simple linen shirt, the collar undone, completely lacking the sartorial elegance expected of a duke in the afternoon. He didn't even notice her at first, moving straight to a side table to pour himself a glass of brandy. Bryleigh kept her head down, sweeping the same spot of immaculate stone over and over, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Leave the rest, girl," August suddenly commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant obedience. "I require the room." "Yes, Your Grace," Bryleigh whispered, gathering her brushes. She scurried toward the door, her eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards. But as she reached the threshold, she couldn't help but steal one last glance over her shoulder. August was standing over the desk, staring down at the coded journal with a look of pure, unadulterated despair. He ran a hand through his dark hair, gripping the edges of the desk until his knuckles turned white. In that fleeting moment, Bryleigh recognized a kindred spirit. He was a man drowning in a mystery he could not solve. She knew the key. She could read the words that were tormenting him. But to speak up was to risk everything. She slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, carrying the weight of a dangerous secret down into the dark, damp belly of the manor. For 3 weeks, the coded journal haunted Bryleigh. It invaded her thoughts as she beat the rugs. It danced behind her eyelids when she finally collapsed onto her narrow straw mattress in the attic. She knew the dangers of involvement. She was a disgraced noblewoman hiding from the law. Drawing the attention of a duke was the height of folly. Yet the agonizing puzzle gnawed at her brilliant mind. Furthermore, a strange, unbidden empathy for August had taken root in her chest. She watched him waste away, pacing the grounds at dawn, dismissing his meals untouched. He was a man consumed by a ghost, and Bryleigh, who had her own ghosts to bear, found herself yearning to ease his burden. The opportunity, when it arrived, was born of sheer exhaustion and a lapse in household security. It was a Tuesday night, shortly before midnight. A violent autumn storm was lashing against the stone walls of Pembroke Manor, the thunder masking the creak of the floorboards. Bryleigh had been ordered to clean the library's massive fireplace after a chimney sweep had left a dreadful mess. The room was supposed to be empty. The Duke had reportedly retired to his chambers hours ago, complaining of a migraine. Armed with a solitary candle, Bryleigh entered the cavernous library. The towering shelves of books cast long, monstrous shadows across the Persian carpets. She set her bucket down and moved toward the desk to ensure no soot had settled on the papers. There it was, the journal. It sat precisely where it had been weeks ago, open to a new page. The flickering candlelight illuminated the chaotic strings of characters. Bryleigh hesitated, her fingers hovering inches from the leather binding. "Just one sentence," she told herself, "just to see if I truly remember the syntax." She set her candle on the desk, She closed her eyes, visualizing the intricate, shifting alphabet her father had drilled into her memory. She took a deep breath, opened her eyes, and began to trace the lines of the cipher. 74 Alpha 9 Omega, 12 Sigma. Her lips began to move silently, translating the code into French, the language of its origin, before converting it to English in her mind. The transition was so natural, so deeply ingrained in her intellect, that she didn't realize she had begun to whisper the translation aloud. The shipments from Calais are secured, Bryleigh whispered into the empty room, her soot-stained finger tracing the line. Lord Reginald guarantees the local magistrates are compromised. The Duke suspects nothing of the naval contracts. Bryleigh stopped, her blood turning to ice. Lord Reginald, August's uncle, the man who currently managed the estate's finances and had taken a paternal role since the late Duke's passing. The journal wasn't just a diary, it was a ledger of treason. The late Duke had discovered his own brother was smuggling and selling naval secrets to the French. He was going to expose him. Bryleigh gasped softly, the horrific realization washing over her. That's why the carriage crashed. Reginald killed him. A sharp crack of lightning illuminated the library, blindingly bright. And in that flash of white light, Bryleigh saw him. August Sullivan was sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair in the darkest corner of the room, a half-empty decanter of whiskey by his side. He had been sitting in the pitch black, swallowed by the shadows, watching her. Bryleigh let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, knocking her candle to the floor. The flame sputtered and died, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the dying embers in the grate and the intermittent flashes of lightning. Do not move, August's voice sliced through the darkness. It was quiet, lethal, and completely devoid of the aristocratic drawl he usually employed. Bryleigh was paralyzed. The punishment for a servant reading private correspondence was severe. The punishment for a servant discovering a treasonous murder plot involving the Duke's own blood was undoubtedly fatal. She heard the rustle of fabric, the heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching her. A match flared, blinding her momentarily as August lit a candelabra on the desk. The golden light illuminated his face. He looked terrifying, a predator cornering its prey. He looked down at the journal, then back at Bryleigh, taking in her ragged dress, her trembling hands, the smudge of ash across her pale cheek. "Repeat what you just said," August commanded, stepping closer. I know not what you mean, Your Grace," Bryleigh stammered, frantically trying to resurrect her coarse, uneducated servant's accent. "I was but cleaning the grate, and I—" "Do not insult my intelligence," August interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was entirely unyielding, yet surprisingly warm. "I heard you. You were speaking fluent French. You were reading a cipher that has defeated 3 scholars from Oxford. Who are you?" "I am Betty, Your Grace. Please, I meant no harm," Bryleigh pleaded, struggling weakly against his grip. "Betty from the scullery does not read the visionaire shift," August said, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her features. "Nor does she possess the refined diction you slipped into when you thought yourself alone." He pulled her slightly closer, holding her hand up to the candlelight. "Your hands are blistered and stained, yes, but your fingernails are naturally manicured, not naturally broad. The calluses on your fingers are from the last year of labor, but beneath them there is the smooth skin of a woman who was raised holding nothing heavier than a teacup or a pen." Bryleigh's breath hitched. He was too observant. He had spent months on the battlefield analyzing enemy movements. He was applying the same ruthless scrutiny to her. "I will ask you one final time," August said, his gaze locking onto hers. The proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, the clean scent of soap, the raw, vibrating tension radiating from his body. "Who sent you? Is it Reginald? Has he planted a spy in my own home to see if I have deciphered my father's notes?" "No!" Bryleigh cried out, the desperation cracking her facade entirely. Her true voice, cultured, desperate, and fiercely proud, rang out in the quiet room. "I am not a spy. I am hiding from men far worse than your uncle, your grace." August's eyes widened a fraction. The change in her voice was undeniable. The cowering maid had vanished, replaced by a woman of equal standing. "Then translate the rest of the page," he demanded, releasing her wrist, but trapping her between his body and the heavy mahogany desk. "Prove you are not an enemy. Give me the words that my father died for." The storm outside raged on, rain pelting the stained glass windows like handfuls of gravel. Inside the library, the silence was suffocating. Bryleigh rubbed her wrist, her mind racing through her utterly dismal options. If she refused, he would hand her over to the magistrate as a thief and a spy. Her true identity would be discovered, and she would hang for her father's supposed crimes. If she complied, she stepped willingly into a deadly family feud. She looked up into August's eyes. Beneath the anger and the suspicion, she saw the raw, gaping wound of grief. He was a son desperately seeking justice for a father he loved. "If I read this," Bryleigh said, her voice steadying, shedding the last remnants of Betty the maid, "you must promise me protection. Not as your servant, but as your cryptographer. When this is done, you will provide me with a sum of money and safe passage to America. You will ask no questions of my past." August looked genuinely taken aback. A scullery maid dictating terms to a duke was unheard of. Yet he didn't laugh. He studied her face, the fierce intelligence blazing in her eyes that soot and ash could not hide. "You are in no position to negotiate, madam," he warned, softly. "I am the only position that matters, your grace," Bryleigh countered, lifting her chin. "You have possessed that journal for months. If you could read it, your uncle would already be in the tower. You need me, and I need a way out." A tense moment stretched between them. August's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. He gave a single curt nod. "You have my word as a gentleman and a peer of the realm," August said. "Now, read." Bryleigh turned back to the journal. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was eclipsed by the thrill of the intellectual challenge. She leaned over the desk, the candlelight casting a golden halo over her messy hair. "The cipher key changes every third sentence," she explained, her voice taking on a clinical, authoritative tone. "It relies on a text. Given the date of the entries, I suspect the late Duke was using a specific edition of a book common to his library to set the shift." She scanned the shelves. "Do you have a first edition of Gibbon's Decline and Fall?" August wordlessly walked to a shelf, retrieved a heavy volume, and placed it beside the journal. For the next 2 hours, the Duke and the maid stood shoulder to shoulder in the candlelight. The vast social chasm between them vanished, replaced by the intimacy of shared secrecy. August watched in awe as Bryleigh's mind worked. She was brilliant, her fingers flying across the pages, translating the gibberish into a horrifying narrative. The late Duke had indeed discovered Lord Reginald's treason. Reginald had been systematically siphoning funds from the estate to bribe dock workers and naval officers, selling fleet movements to French privateers. The final entry in the journal, dated the day of the fatal carriage ride, was a draft of a letter the late Duke intended to send to the Home Secretary. Bryleigh finished translating the final line and sat back, her shoulders aching. She pushed a loose strand of hair out of her eyes, leaving a streak of soot across her forehead. "He knew," Bryleigh whispered, staring at the translation she had hastily written on a piece of scrap parchment. Your father knew Reginald was coming for him. He wrote that the axle of his carriage had been tampered with, but he had to risk the journey to London to deliver the evidence. August was silent. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the parchment. The confirmation of his worst fears did not bring a dramatic outburst. Instead, a terrifying, icy calm settled over him. The melancholy Duke was gone. In his place stood the ruthless soldier who had survived the horrors of the peninsula. "He murdered him," August said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My uncle murdered my father for coin." He turned to look at Bryleigh. For the first time, he seemed to truly see her, not as a puzzle, not as a servant, but as a woman who had just handed him the sword to avenge his family. "I don't know your name," August said softly. "It is safer for both of us if you don't," Bryleigh replied, stepping back, suddenly hyper-aware of her dishevelled state and their extreme proximity. "I have fulfilled my end of the bargain. I expect you to honor yours when the time comes." "I will," August promised. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek, wiping away the smudge of soot. The contact sent a shock wave through Bryleigh's system. It was a terribly intimate gesture, crossing lines that society deemed uncrossable. "But you cannot return to the scullery," August continued, dropping his hand, though his eyes remained locked on hers. "If Reginald realizes I have deciphered the journal, he will try to kill me. And if he discovers you are the one who translated it, you will be dead before morning. You are in this now, deeply." "What are you suggesting?" Bryleigh asked, her pulse quickening. "Tomorrow morning, I will inform Mrs. Rutledge that you have been promoted," August declared. "You will be moved to the guest wing. You will serve as my private secretary. We have an entire ledger of encoded financial records to go through to build a case the Crown cannot ignore." "A maid suddenly elevated to a private secretary?" Bryleigh scoffed nervously. "That will draw every suspicious eye in the county, especially your uncle's." August smiled, a dangerous, wolfish grin that made Bryleigh's breath catch. "Let them look. Let them whisper. We will hide the truth in plain sight. They will assume I have taken you as my mistress." Bryleigh gasped, her face flushing crimson. "I will not ruin what is left of my honor for your schemes." "Your honor is safe with me," August said, stepping closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. "But it is the only plausible lie that explains why a duke spends his days and nights locked behind closed doors with a beautiful servant. You asked for protection. I am giving it to you. But we play a deadly game now, madam. Will you trust me?" He extended his hand. Bryleigh looked at it, trembling. Taking that hand meant stepping out of the shadows and into the firing line. It meant binding herself to a man who was as dangerous as he was captivating. She took a deep breath, raised her chin, and placed her hand in his. "God help me," she whispered. "I accept." By dawn, the hierarchy of Pembroke Manor had been entirely overthrown, though the dust had not yet settled to reveal the new order. Mrs. Agatha Rutledge, whose iron grip on the household was legendary, stood in the servants' hall with a complexion that resembled curdled milk. "The guest wing?" Mrs. Rutledge sputtered, her gaze fixed on the towering, impassive figure of the Duke's valet. "You are telling me that Betty from the scullery is to be moved to the blue damask suite? The suite reserved for visiting royalty?" "His Grace's orders are absolute, Mrs. Rutledge," the valet replied smoothly, though a flicker of bewilderment danced in his own eyes. "She is no longer to be addressed as Betty. She is Miss Bryleigh, the Duke's private secretary. You are to provide her with suitable garments from the late Duchess's stored trunks until a modiste can be summoned from London." The whispers ignited instantly. A private secretary? It was a laughable disguise. In the brutal, glittering world of 19th century society, a wealthy, unmarried duke sequestering a young, beautiful servant in his private quarters meant only one thing. By noon, the rumour that August Sullivan had taken the soot-stained Maid as his mistress had reached the stables. By evening, it would reach the neighbouring estates. Bryleigh, standing in the centre of the opulent blue damask suite, felt entirely untethered from reality. Gone was the coarse, scratching wool of her servant's uniform. In its place, she wore a tailored gown of midnight blue silk. It was slightly dated, belonging to August's late mother, but the rich fabric draped flawlessly over her frame, restoring a physical dignity she had not felt in 2 years. Her blistered hands were hidden beneath fine lace gloves, and a maid, one who had sneered at her only yesterday, had painstakingly washed the ash from her hair, pinning the dark curls into a sophisticated, understated style. When Bryleigh finally descended the grand staircase and entered the library, August looked up from his desk. For a long, dangerous moment, the air vanished from the room. His grey eyes swept over her, taking in the transformation not with the leering gaze of a master, but with the sharp, evaluating stare of a soldier recognizing a formidable ally. "You look," August began, his gravelly voice trailing off. He cleared his throat, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "You look ready for war, madam. Please, sit. We have much ground to cover." Between them lay a mountain of leather-bound ledgers. These were Lord Reginald's domain, the financial heartbeat of the Pembroke estate. "He has hidden his treason well," August explained, pacing behind his desk. "The official accounts are immaculate, but my father's notes indicated a shadow ledger, a set of coded transactions masquerading as agricultural exports to the continent." Bryleigh drew off her gloves, exposing her calloused fingers. She pulled the heaviest ledger toward her, the thrill of the hunt sharpening her senses. "If it is a cipher, I will break it. Show me the cargo manifests from the spring of 1814. For hours, the only sounds in the library were the scratch of Bryleigh's quill, the ticking of the grand clock, and the crackle of the fire. They worked in a synchronized, intense silence. Bryleigh discovered that Reginald was not merely smuggling goods, he was smuggling information. He was using a mercantile code, embedding military intelligence within grain shipments. "Look at this," Bryleigh said suddenly, her voice tight with disbelief. She pointed to a column of figures. "These aren't bushels of wheat. These coordinates correspond to naval blockades in the English Channel. And this date?" She looked up at August, her eyes wide. This was sent directly to a French contact weeks before the Battle of Toulouse. He was selling Arthur Wellesley's supply routes. August's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle feathered in his cheek. The mention of Wellesley, the revered Duke of Wellington, under whom August had bled and fought, struck a deeply personal nerve. He traded the lives of English soldiers, men I commanded, for French gold. Before the heavy silence could settle, the double doors of the library were thrown open without a knock. Lord Reginald Sullivan strode into the room. He was a handsome man in his late 50s, possessing the aristocratic polish that August consciously rejected. He wore an immaculately tailored riding habit, his silver-tipped cane striking the floorboards with arrogant authority. "August, my boy," Reginald boomed, his smile not quite reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "I came as soon as I heard the utterly absurd rumours circulating the village. A scullery maid? Elevated to the guest wing? Truly, the isolation of this manor is rotting your senses." Reginald's gaze snapped to Bryleigh. He paused, clearly taken aback by the elegant, composed woman sitting at his nephew's desk. He had expected a cowering, uneducated peasant girl. Instead, Bryleigh met his stare with glacial indifference. "Uncle," August said smoothly, not rising from his chair. "Allow me to introduce Miss Bryleigh. She is assisting me with the estate's archives." "Archives?" Reginald sneered, recovering his composure. He stepped closer, his eyes raking over Bryleigh. "My dear, you must forgive my nephew. The war left him with a penchant for eccentricity. Tell me, what could a girl from the kitchens possibly know of managing an estate?" Bryleigh did not flinch. She leaned back in her chair, adopting the exact posture of a bored aristocrat entertaining a lesser peer. "Very little of managing an estate, my lord, but I know a great deal about numbers, and I find His Grace's accounts to be endlessly fascinating." The double meaning hung in the air like a drawn blade. Reginald's smile stiffened. He glanced at the open ledgers on the desk, then back to Bryleigh, a flicker of genuine suspicion finally penetrating his arrogance. "Indeed," Reginald murmured softly. "We must ensure you do not find them too fascinating, Miss Bryleigh. Numbers can be remarkably confusing for a fragile mind." "I assure you, my lord," Bryleigh replied, her voice smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "My mind is anything but fragile." In the week that followed Lord Reginald's intrusion, the atmosphere within Pembroke Manor grew suffocating. Reginald did not return to his own estate. Instead, he installed himself in the East Wing, citing a desire to keep his dear nephew company. In reality, he was an occupying force, watching every door, questioning every servant, and circling the library like a vulture. The forced proximity accelerated the desperate work behind the locked doors of the study. Bryleigh and August were running out of time. Reginald was systematically destroying older financial records under the guise of spring cleaning. They needed undeniable proof, a document written in Reginald's own hand, clearly linking the coded naval intelligence to his personal bank accounts in London. The long nights of deciphering codes began to strip away the barriers between the Duke and the former Maid. By midnight, the formalities dissolved. August would shed his cravat and jacket, pacing the room while dictating his memories of troop movements in Spain, helping Bryleigh align the historical dates with Reginald's coded shipments. Bryleigh, exhausted but intellectually invigorated, would often find August watching her with an intensity that made her skin heat. "Why did you not go to the magistrate when your father died?" August asked softly one evening, pouring her a cup of tea. He knew of her past now. He knew she was the disgraced daughter of a viscount, though she had vehemently refused to disclose her family name, terrified it would bring the crown's wrath upon them both. Bryleigh stared into the fire. "Because my father was a brilliant man, and the evidence against him was flawless. Forgeries, planted letters, bribed witnesses. The people who ruined him owned the magistrates. If I had stayed, I would have hanged alongside his memory. I chose to disappear." August knelt beside her chair, placing the teacup on the side table. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently covering her ink-stained fingers. "You are not invisible anymore, Bryleigh, and you will not hang. When this is finished, I will see your father's name cleared. I swear it." It was a dangerous promise, and they both knew it. The air between them crackled, heavy with the unspoken realization that their partnership had mutated into something profoundly deep and terrifyingly intimate. But before the moment could crest, the harsh reality of their situation intervened. Reginald, sensing the walls closing in, orchestrated a masterstroke. He announced a formal dinner party to be held at Pembroke Manor, inviting the most powerful and ruthless figures in the county, including Lord Hawthorne, a notoriously corrupt magistrate deeply indebted to Reginald. "It is a trap," August growled, throwing the guest list onto the desk. "He intends to parade you before the county. He wants to prove to Hawthorne that I am of unsound mind, keeping a delusional maid as a secretary. so he can petition the Crown for legal conservatorship of the Pembroke estate. Once he controls the estate, he controls the evidence." "Then we will not give him the satisfaction," Bryleigh said, her eyes flashing with a competitive fire she hadn't felt since her days in London society. "Let him host his dinner. While he is busy attempting to humiliate me in the dining room, his guard will be down." The night of the dinner party, the manor blazed with 1,000 candles. Bryleigh descended the stairs in a gown of deep emerald silk, her chin held high. She knew the role she had to play, the enigmatic, devastatingly beautiful companion who was completely unfazed by the sneers of the aristocracy. Dinner was a battlefield, masked by crystal glasses and silver forks. Reginald sat at the head of the table, steering the conversation toward complex political and economic matters, clearly intending to leave Bryleigh hopelessly out of her depth. "Tell me, Miss Bryleigh," Lord Hawthorne drawled, swirling his wine, "what is your opinion on the Chancellor's recent imposition of the Corn Laws? Surely, given your unique background, you must have a perspective on the price of grain." The table fell silent. The surrounding lords and ladies waited for the uneducated maid to stumble. Bryleigh took a slow, elegant sip of her water. "I find the Chancellor's approach to be dangerously short-sighted, Lord Hawthorne," she replied, her enunciation flawless, her voice carrying effortlessly across the long table. "While it artificially inflates the domestic land values, benefiting men like yourselves, naturally, it cripples the mercantile fleet's ability to trade surplus, ultimately weakening the Crown's naval leverage against the French blockades. It is a policy driven by localized greed, masquerading as national security." The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Hawthorne choked slightly on his wine. Reginald's smug expression shattered into a mask of pure, undisguised shock. August, seated at the opposite end of the table, hid a fiercely proud smile behind his napkin. Bryleigh had not just survived the trap, she had dismantled it in front of the county's elite. But the victory was a dangerous one. Bryleigh's display of high-born education and geopolitical understanding confirmed Reginald's worst fears. This was no scullery maid. This was a highly trained operative. While the guests retired to the drawing room for music, Reginald slipped away. The distraction was exactly what he needed. He bypassed the guards August had posted, using a servant's passage he had known since childhood, and infiltrated the Duke's private study. He moved quickly, his hands tearing through the desk drawers. He didn't need the ledgers. He needed the key. And there, tucked beneath a heavy silver inkwell, he found it. It was a single piece of parchment. On it, Bryleigh had written out the visionaire shift, alongside a half-translated sentence from Reginald's most recent, highly treasonous letter to a French operative in Calais. Reginald stared at the paper, his blood running cold. They knew. The Duke and his mistress had deciphered everything. A dark, murderous rage twisted Reginald's features. His grand plan, his wealth, his very life were hanging by a thread held in the hands of the woman currently sipping tea in the drawing room. He crumpled the parchment into his pocket and drew a small, silver-handled pistol from his coat. The time for subtle poisons and staged carriage accidents had passed. If he was to survive the night, Bryleigh had to die, and the Duke of Pembroke would tragically lose his mind to grief, taking his own life in the aftermath. Reginald stepped back into the hidden passage, the darkness swallowing him whole, as he began the silent hunt for the woman who knew too much. The drawing room of Pembroke Manor was a masterclass in gilded suffocation. The air, thick with the scent of expensive rosewater and beeswax, pressed down on Bryleigh as a string quartet played a lively Mozart piece that entirely failed to cut the tension. Lord Hawthorne and the other local elites had retreated into guarded murmurs, casting sidelong glances at the enigmatic woman in the emerald gown who had so thoroughly dismantled their political discourse. Bryleigh maintained her poised exterior, but a cold prickle of dread had begun to crawl up the back of her neck. Reginald had been absent for nearly half an hour. Catching August's eye across the room, she gave a microscopic tilt of her head toward the door. The Duke, currently trapped in a conversation with a dowager countess, narrowed his eyes in sudden understanding. His posture stiffened. The relaxed, aristocratic host instantly replaced by the battle-hardened officer. He gave Bryleigh a single, sharp nod. "Go." Slipping out of the drawing-room under the guise of requiring a moment's respite, Bryleigh navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the manor. The heavy oak doors of the library loomed ahead, the only sanctuary in a house full of enemies. She turned the brass handle and slipped inside, instantly plunging into the cool, leather-scented darkness. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rugs. She walked toward the desk, intending to secure the translated parchment she had left beneath the silver inkwell. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the inkwell. It was displaced, and the parchment was gone. "Looking for this, my dear?" The voice slithered out from the deepest corner of the room, near the towering shelves of encyclopedias. A match flared, a sudden, violent burst of sulphur and yellow light, illuminating Lord Reginald's face. He looked entirely different from the suave aristocrat who had sneered at her over the dinner table. His features were pulled taut, his eyes wide and frantic, with the cornered desperation of a condemned man. In his left hand, he held the crumpled parchment. In his right, levelled directly at Bryleigh's heart, was a silver-barreled dueling pistol. Bryleigh's breath hitched, but she forced her feet to remain planted. She was the daughter of a viscount. She would not cower before a traitor. "You have made a grave miscalculation, Lord Reginald," Bryleigh said, her voice dropping to a cool, lethal register. "If you fire that weapon, the sound will bring the Duke and every servant in this wing down upon you." "Let them come!" Reginald spat, stepping fully into the moonlight filtering through the storm-lashed windows. By the time they breach the door, the tragic scene will be set. A mad, unhinged maid, consumed by delusions of grandeur, attempted to burn the estate's ledgers. I, the dutiful uncle, intervened to save the family history and was forced to defend myself. A tragedy, indeed. He cocked the hammer of the pistol. The mechanical click echoed like a guillotine dropping in the silent room. "It is a brilliant lie," Bryleigh countered, desperately calculating the distance between herself and the heavy bronze paperweight on the desk. "But it will not save you from the Home Office. The cipher is broken. August knows you sold the Channel Fleet's coordinates to the French." Reginald laughed, a harsh, grating sound devoid of any humour. "August is a broken soldier playing at being a duke. He has no proof. This piece of parchment is the only translation, and it will burn with you." He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face in the dim light. The arrogance suddenly bled from his expression, replaced by a chilling, dawning comprehension. "You know," Reginald murmured, his head tilting to the side, "at dinner, when you spoke of the mercantile fleets and the French blockades, your cadence was remarkably familiar. I could not place it then, blinded by my own irritation, but looking at you now, in the light, stripping away the soot and the servants' rags, a terrible suffocating dread seized Bryleigh's chest. "You have his eyes," Reginald whispered, a twisted smile stretching across his face. "The Viscount, Lord Castlereagh's prized cryptographer. You are his disgraced pup, aren't you? The little prodigy who vanished after her father took a pistol to his own temple." Bryleigh's blood turned to ice. "Do not speak of my father. You are not fit to utter his name." "Oh, but I am intricately woven into his legacy, my dear," Reginald crowed, a sickening, triumphant glee in his voice. "Who do you think provided the War Office with the evidence of his treason? The forged letters to the French magistrate? The phantom bank accounts? Your father was a brilliant man, but he was entirely too inquisitive. He began to notice the discrepancies in the naval funding. My discrepancies. He was going to ruin my enterprise. The revelation struck Bryleigh with the physical force of a cannonball. The agonizing grief of the past 2 years, the shame, the grueling labor in the scullery. It was all the design of the man standing before her. Reginald had not only murdered his own brother, he had destroyed her family to protect his treason. "You framed him," Bryleigh whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. "You murdered an innocent man, destroyed my family's honor, and forced him to his death." "It was nothing personal, simply a business necessity," Reginald replied smoothly, raising the pistol higher. "Just as this is. I must admit, the irony is exquisite. The father dies to protect my secrets, and 2 years later, the daughter dies for the exact same reason. Farewell, my lady." Reginald's finger tightened on the trigger. Crack! The sound was deafening, but it did not come from the pistol. The heavy oak door of the library was kicked open with such explosive violence that the hinges shrieked and splintered. August Sullivan stood in the doorway, framed by the corridor light, a veritable god of war. He had shed his formal evening jacket. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, and his eyes burned with a terrifying, murderous fury. Reginald spun around, startled by the intrusion, his pistol wavering for a fraction of a second. That fraction was all the Duke of Wellington's finest cavalry officer required. August did not shout or hesitate. He lunged across the room with terrifying, lethal speed, closing the distance before Reginald could realign his weapon. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet tearing through the emerald silk of Bryleigh's sleeve and burying itself into the mahogany desk, showering her in wood splinters. August slammed into Reginald with the force of a battering ram. The older man was thrown backward, crashing into the bookshelves. Heavy volumes of encyclopedias rained down upon them as August grabbed Reginald's wrist, twisting it with a sickening snap. Reginald screamed in agony, dropping the pistol. August did not stop. He hauled his uncle up by the lapels of his immaculate coat and drove a crushing blow into Reginald's jaw. The traitor slumped to the floor, coughing blood, his aristocratic facade entirely annihilated. August stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched tight enough to draw blood from his own palms. He looked down at the man who had ordered his father's death, the man who had just tried to murder the woman he had sworn to protect. "You are done, uncle," August growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, absolute authority. August turned, his frantic gaze sweeping the room until he found Bryleigh. She was leaning against the desk, clutching her arm where the bullet had grazed the silk, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with an unyielding fire. In 2 strides, August was at her side, his large hands gently gripping her shoulders. "Are you injured? Bryleigh, look at me. Did he strike you?" "I am unharmed," Bryleigh breathed, the adrenaline surging through her veins. She looked from August to the groaning figure of Reginald on the floor. The hard karma of the universe had finally tipped its scales. The architect of her ruin was broken at her feet. He confessed, August. He confessed to framing my father to hide his naval treason. He orchestrated it all. August's jaw tightened. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a fleck of wood splinter from her cheek. "I know. I heard enough from the corridor." He turned his head as the sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. Lord Hawthorne and the other dinner guests, drawn by the gunshot, crowded into the shattered doorway, their faces pale with shock. Behind them, pushing through the terrified aristocrats, stepped a severe-looking man in a dark, understated coat. It was Mr. Sterling Hayes, an elite agent of Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary. August had secretly dispatched his valet to London 3 days prior with a preliminary translation of the cipher, bypassing the corrupt local magistrates entirely. "Your Grace," the agent said, stepping into the room and taking in the scene. The bloody, broken lord on the floor, the bullet hole in the desk, and the fiercely composed woman standing at the Duke's side. "Mr. Hayes," August said, his voice ringing with absolute command, "I present to you Lord Reginald Sullivan. I charge him with the murder of the late Duke of Pembroke, high treason against the Crown, and the malicious framing of the Viscount. You will find the translated ledgers in my safe, and the cipher key in his left pocket. Take this filth out of my home." The arrest of Lord Reginald Sullivan sent a shock wave through the British Empire that eclipsed any scandal of the decade. Stripped of his titles, his wealth seized by the Crown, Reginald was dragged in irons to the Tower of London to await a trial that would inevitably end at the gallows. The network of corrupt magistrates, including Lord Hawthorne, collapsed in his wake, facing swift and brutal investigations by the Home Office. But the most profound restoration of justice occurred in the quiet, sunlit offices of Whitehall. Armed with Reginald's confiscated ledgers and Bryleigh's flawless decryption of the shadow accounts, the Prime Minister himself, Lord Liverpool, issued a formal royal decree. The late Viscount was posthumously exonerated of all charges of treason. His name was cleared, his seized assets were placed into a trust, and his stolen honour was restored to the annals of history. 3 weeks after the violent storm that had shattered the secrets of Pembroke Manor, the estate lay bathed in the crisp, golden light of an early winter morning. The suffocating shadows that had plagued the halls had been banished. Bryleigh stood by the grand windows of the library, looking out over the sprawling, frost-kissed gardens. She was no longer dressed in the borrowed, dated silks of the late Duchess, nor the coarse wool of a scullery maid. She wore a beautifully tailored riding habit of dark velvet, purchased with her own reclaimed inheritance. She was, once, again, the Honorable Bryleigh, a woman of independent wealth and immaculate standing. She held a letter in her hand, a formal invitation from the War Office, offering her a highly classified position within their cryptographic division, recognizing her extraordinary intellect. She was free. She could return to London, reclaim her place in society, and build a life entirely on her own terms. The heavy oak doors of the library, newly repaired and polished, opened softly. August stepped into the room. The dark, brooding melancholy that had haunted his eyes for months was entirely gone. He walked with the confident, commanding stride of a man who had conquered his ghosts. He crossed the room, stopping just behind her, close enough that she could feel the ambient heat of his body. "A letter from Whitehall?" August asked, his deep voice sending a familiar, thrilling shiver down her spine. "They are fools if they do not offer you a kingdom to decipher their enemies' secrets." Bryleigh turned to face him, a soft, wistful smile playing on her lips. "They offered me a position, a very lucrative one. I could leave for London tomorrow." August's expression stilled. He looked down at her, his grey eyes intensely searching hers. The terrifying proximity between them, born in midnight whispers and forged in gunfire, hummed with an undeniable magnetic pull. "Is that what you wish?" August asked quietly. "To return to the society that turned its back on you the moment your father was accused?" "It is what I fought for," Bryleigh replied, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "To step out of the shadows, to be recognized not as a maid or a hidden secretary, but as myself. You were never just a maid to me, Bryleigh, August said, taking a step closer, eliminating the space between them entirely. He reached out, his strong, calloused hands gently enveloping hers, entirely ignoring the letter she held. Even when you were covered in soot, scrubbing my hearth, I saw the fire in your mind. You saved my life. You brought justice to my father. You stepped into the darkness with me when you had every reason to run. Bryleigh looked up into his eyes, her breath catching at the raw, unguarded emotion laid bare in his gaze. This was not the hardened soldier, nor the arrogant duke. This was the man who had knelt beside her chair, who had fought a murderer bare-handed to keep her safe. August, she whispered. Go to London if it is what your heart demands, August continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly, desperate murmur. Take the position at Whitehall. Reclaim your father's estate. But know that if you go, you take the heart of this manor with you. You take my heart with you. He slowly raised his hand, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her jaw, his touch sending sparks of electricity through her skin. I do not want you as my secretary, Bryleigh. I do not want you as my cryptographic partner, August confessed, his eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze with searing intensity. I want you as my equal, my confidant, my wife. I want you to be the Duchess of Pembroke, not to hide you from the world, but to force the world to bow to the brilliant, courageous woman who conquered my soul. A tear slipped free from Bryleigh's eye, a profound release of the grief, the fear, and the sheer exhaustion of the past 2 years. She looked at the letter from Whitehall in her hand, a symbol of a solitary, independent life. Then she looked at the man standing before her, a man who respected her intellect as much as he adored her spirit. With a decisive, beautiful movement, Bryleigh let the letter slip from her fingers. It fluttered to the Persian rug, forgotten. She reached up, tangling her fingers in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down to her. Their kiss was an explosion of suppressed longing, a fierce, desperate claiming that wiped away the last remnants of their tragic pasts. It was the colliding of two brilliant, scarred souls who had walked through the fires of betrayal and emerged forged in unbreakable steel. August wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor, holding her as if she were the most precious, vital thing in his universe. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Bryleigh rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beating of his heart. To hell with London society, Bryleigh whispered, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking across her face. I believe there are far more interesting mysteries to unravel here in Pembroke. August laughed, a rich, joyous sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the library. He kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. The scullery maid had not just survived the Duke's manor, she had conquered it, unearthing its darkest secrets and claiming its master's heart. Bryleigh had lost a title to treachery, but through her own brilliant defiance, she had won an empire of love and a justice that would echo through the ages. Bryleigh's journey from a disgraced noblewoman hiding in the ashes of the scullery to the triumphant Duchess of Pembroke proves that true nobility lies not in a title, but in the courage to face the darkness and the brilliant intellect to dismantle corruption. She and August turned a tragic twist of fate into a masterclass of hard karma, proving that the truth, no matter how deeply buried in cipher and shadow, will always fight its way into the light. The corrupt met their absolute ruin, and the righteous reclaimed their stolen honor.